Welcome to the debate. Today, we're digging into the approval of the terms of reference for the 8th Central Pay Commission. This is a pretty monumental governmental decision, really. It kicks off a whole new cycle for revising salaries, pensions, allowances, and this affects, about 50 lakh serving central government employees and another 69 lakh pensioners across the country. The sheer scale of this change is just, enormous.
It really is. The stakes are incredibly high, and the commission, which is now officially up and running, led by former Supreme Court Judge Ranjana Prakash Desai, they've got 18 months to pull together their findings. Everything seems to be pointing towards an implementation date of January 1st, 2026, and naturally, this timeline is driving some pretty intense speculation among all those beneficiaries.
Absolutely. And that speculation, it seems to be overwhelmingly focused on one fairly technical measure, the fitment factor. Now, for anyone maybe not familiar, the fitment factor is basically the multiplier. It's applied to the existing basic pay to figure out the new pay scale. And it's designed to sort of compress the old structure into the new one. It really is the key, to determining just how big the raise will be.
Exactly. And that's precisely where our core conflict, our debate for today, lies. Should expectations really be driven by those maximum potential increases? The really high-end projections based on, let's say, ambitious historical precedent? Or should we perhaps temper that enthusiasm a bit and anchor expectations in more conservative, fiscally conscious expert predictions?
Right. So I'll be making the case that history, and really the structural mandate of the Pay Commission itself, compels us to focus on the potential for a really substantial, high-impact salary revision. We have to use the most ambitious, yet previously successful mechanisms as our baseline for what the government can do and arguably should deliver.
And I'll be coming at it from a slightly different angle. While yes, the ambition is laudable, I think anchoring expectations to those maximum figures might be, economically irresponsible. I believe we need to adopt a more grounded perspective, one based on specific expert analysis that properly takes into account, the current inflationary environment and the overall fiscal health of the nation.
Okay, so my perspective here really centers on history and potential. The track record of the pay commissions, it provides a strong, transformative foundation for setting high expectations. We're not just looking for marginal adjustments here. We're talking about necessary structural revisions. Revisions designed to catch up with inflation and, importantly, consolidate those pay grades. And we have concrete projections out there already, established projections showing salaries could potentially rise by up to 19,000 rupees per month. That's based on applying a possible fitment factor of 2.86. But let's just look back at the precedent set by the 7th Pay Commission. That commission used a 2.57 fitment factor, and it successfully restructured pay, resulting in a, frankly, massive 157% hike in the minimum basic pay. Now, this isn't just some abstract number. This shows the proven capacity for transformation. If that same 2.57 factor were applied again today, the minimum basic pay, currently 18,000 rupees, would jump to a really compelling 46,260 rupees. And the minimum pension would go from 9,000 rupees to 23,130 rupees. This historical baseline, it sets the scale of potential and, frankly, expectation for 50 lakh employees who are looking to restructure their financial futures based on this.
That is, I'll grant you, a compelling set of historical data. But I do think we need to pump the brakes a little on that maximum optimism. While citing that 157% hike from the 7th CPC is, exciting, anchoring expectations solely to that maximum ignores some crucial warnings from financial experts. And it also ignores the, let's be honest, uncomfortable current fiscal realities. Doing so really risks creating a massive wave of disappointment down the line. The fact is, experts are already on record stating that applying the 7th CPC factor of 2.57 today, which would get us to that $46,260 minimum, is simply unrealistic. We can't just dismiss that caution lightly. Surely the responsible approach has to be more moderate. Look at the specific suggestion made by the former Finance Secretary, Subhash Chandra Garg. He proposed a factor closer to 1.92. Now, don't get me wrong, 1.92 is still a huge increase.
This more conservative factor still translates to a 92% increase. That takes the minimum basic pay to 34,560 rupees. Now, that is a highly significant, arguably life-changing increase for many, but it's also one that's far more fiscally defensible and, crucially, economically sustainable in the long term. I think this is the grounded reality we should probably be focusing on.
You keep bringing us back to fiscal reality, which is fair, but you seem to ignore the historical engine of this kind of change. The 7th Pay Commission's 2.57 fitment factor. It wasn't just plucked out of thin air. It was a necessary mechanism at the time. It successfully elevated the minimum basic pay from a very low 7,000 rupees up to 18,000 rupees. It served as the intellectual benchmark for what the government must do periodically to consolidate pay grades, adjust for what was decades of, frankly, failing inflation indexing, and maintain real wage growth. That structural need, the need to ensure government salaries stay competitive and fair, it hasn't just evaporated. In fact, the very inclusion of a 2.86 factor in some of these projections suggests that the potential emission remains high. Why? Because the need for a comprehensive structural reset is still recognized. So why should we automatically settle for a 1.92 factor when precedent clearly shows a higher multiplier is often necessary to fulfill the Commission's core structural mandate?
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the context is still the same. I don't think it's intellectually responsible to use a benchmark that financial experts have already specifically flagged as potentially inflationary or even fiscally catastrophic in our current economic climate. The context of moving from a 7,000 rupees minimum, which, let's face it, was deeply undervalued, to 18,000 rupees is vastly, vastly different from attempting to jump from an already improved 18,000 base to nearly 46,260 rupees. We are talking about the sheer absolute monetary outlay here. Implementing a 2.57 factor on the current base, it would require a financial commitment that likely demands massive borrowing or deep cuts in essential capital expenditure, or it could potentially fuel really destabilizing inflation. The 1.92 factor, on the other hand, while still delivering that significant 92% raise at the bottom, reflects a balance. It's a substantial reward for employees, yes, but achieved while maintaining responsible, non-inflationary growth. So the question really becomes, do we prioritize transformative ambition at the risk of economic shock, or do we aim for sustainable, significant improvement? For me, I choose sustainability. And that sustainability, well, it brings us directly back to the stark reality of the budgetary allocation. This acts as a profound constraint on expectations, particularly, I think, for mid-level employees. Let's just look at the numbers for, say, an employee currently earning 1 lakh rupee per month. Their actual pay increase depends entirely on the government's eventual budget decision. Even if the government allocates the absolute maximum projected amount, say 2.25 lakh crores, that mid-level employee's salary only goes up to about 1.18 lakh rupee per month. Now, that's a pretty modest 18% increase. This much lower percentage increase for the median employee stands in really stark opposition to those huge 92% or 157% increases we keep hearing cited for the minimum basic pay scale, the ones derived purely from the fitment factors. It clearly shows that fiscal limitations tend to hit the middle class hardest, and maybe their expectations should be set based more on that 18% ceiling rather than the 157% floor.
Okay, while I acknowledge the data point on the mid-level employee, what you're effectively doing is using a singular outcome metric to dismiss the entire structural mechanism of the pay commission. The fitment factor is the key determinant. It determines the new pay structure itself. It's a mechanism that's applied before the final budget ceiling is even fixed. It determines the base multiplier right across all the pay scales. It effectively sets the non-negotiable floor, which then forces the subsequent discussion about the budgetary allocation. If the Commission recommends, let's say, a 2.86 factor, that reflects a significant governmental intent to fundamentally reset pay scales. The budget then has to find a way to accommodate it or risk abandoning the entire structural framework the Commission was set up to create. The fact that the 7th CPC's 2.57 factor has become the intellectual benchmark means that employees are correctly anticipating a structural reset, not just some minor budgetary tweak. We really have to focus on the scale of the change right at the foundation of the pay matrix. A 92% increase, even under your most cautious scenario, is monumental. And those projections linked to the 2.86 factor, potentially up to 19,000 rupees more per month, that's what millions of households are looking towards. This isn't just about percentage gains in the abstract. It's about restoring purchasing power and, frankly, the dignity of the lowest earners, who are the ones who truly benefit most from that massive percentage jump on a relatively low base salary.
I absolutely agree that the percentage rise at the very bottom end is impressive, truly. But we must stop fixating solely on the percentage gain in minimum pay. We need to focus on the overall equity and, let's be realistic, the political reality of it all. The vast majority of central government employees fall into those mid-level tiers. Now, if the budget allocation holds them to, say, a 14% to 18% increase, while the lowest earners are seeing a 92% jump, well, that disparity, while you could argue it's equitable in principle, it certainly creates significant pressure and potential disappointment in practice. The high fitment factors might deliver a massive structural multiplier to the absolute lowest pay scale, sure, but the budget inevitably acts as a profound tempering force across the substantial middle class. So expectations must be managed for the average employee, not just the minimum base worker. If the government targets a fiscally responsible 1.75 lakh crore allocation, for instance, that mid-level employees' rise is closer to 14%. That, I would argue, is the expectation that matters most to the largest demographic of recipients here.
But isn't that exactly why the focus must be on the structural mechanism first? A constrained budget that perhaps prioritizes a modest 14% hike for the mid-level employee while still managing to deliver a 92% hike to the lowest earners, arguably, that's still a triumph of equity. The fitment factor ensures that the new pay structure is inherently more equitable, more compressive than the old one. We have to trust the Commission to set the appropriate fitment factor based on the structural need, knowing the budget then has to somehow conform to that necessary structural reform. If the budget severely limits the potential for a higher fitment factor, then the entire purpose of having a pay commission, which is, after all, to periodically rationalize pay, is fundamentally undermined.
Undermining the purpose, perhaps, or simply recognizing the hard economic limits of the moment. The Commission isn't operating in a vacuum, is it? Its recommendations have to be politically viable. Proposing a 2.57 factor, knowing full well it could destabilize national finances or force politically toxic cuts elsewhere? Well, that's not rational governance, is it? The 1.92 factor is substantial, it's transformative for the low end, and it's achievable without causing undue fiscal strain. We must perhaps define transformative not just as the largest possible percentage on paper, but as the largest sustainable increase in reality.
Well, I remain convinced that the fitment factor is and should be the primary engine driving expectations here. The precedent set by the 7th CPC justifies, I believe, optimistic anticipation for the final recommendations, particularly for those on the lowest pay scales and the pensioners who most desperately need that transformative, high percentage increase in their base pay. The Commission's mandate is structural change, and the fitment factor is what defines the scale of that change.
And I would reiterate the necessity for, let's call it, intellectual grounding. While a significant raise seems virtually guaranteed, a minimum 92% hike in minimum pay looks plausible even under conservative models. The undeniable dependence on the eventual budgetary allocation and those specific expert warnings about unrealistic factors mandate a more cautious approach to expectations, especially for the majority of mid-level recipients. We should probably expect a substantial, yes, but ultimately measured increase, defined more by fiscal viability than by maximum ambition.
Ultimately, I suppose what this debate really illuminates is that inherent tension. The tension between the structural mandate for fair compensation on one hand and the very real economic constraints of the current government budget on the other.
Indeed, and the sheer complexity of setting that fitment factor while simultaneously finalizing the budgetary commitments ensures this debate isn't ending today. It will certainly continue right up until the panel headed by Justice Desai submits its interim and final reports. Both perspectives, the ambitious projections and the fiscally cautious approach, offer necessary and, I think, valuable insights into what the future holds for central government compensation.